Judge Claudia West was the kind of woman you didn't question twice. In the courtroom, her presence commanded immediate silence. With steel-gray eyes and a voice like polished glass, she had built her entire reputation on fairness, restraint, and integrity. For over 2 decades, she served the state of Georgia with unwavering discipline, rising through the ranks to become one of the youngest female appellate judges in the South. She wore her black robe like armor, never cracking, never bending. And yet, one winter morning, everything shattered. On December 3rd, at 10:42 a.m., in the middle of a routine inmate visitation session at Blackridge Correctional Facility, Judge Claudia West stood up from a gray plastic chair, reached into the lining of her coat, and pulled out a sharpened blade no longer than her palm. In one swift, unrelenting motion, she lunged across the table and stabbed 30-year-old inmate Tyrese Walton in the neck. Not once, but 6 times. By the time guards burst through the door, Tyrese lay slumped forward, bleeding out onto the dull metal surface, gasping for breath. The judge didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She calmly placed the blood-soaked blade on the table, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The entire incident was caught on camera. Every breath, every twitch, every terrifying second. News of the killing ripped through the legal community like a thunderclap. A sitting judge, a woman who had sentenced dozens of men like Tyrese, had just become a killer herself. And the question echoed from courtrooms to cable news. What the hell happened to Claudia West? To answer that, you'd have to go back 6 months. To a courtroom appeal. To a man who knew exactly what to say and how to say it. To a woman whose life, despite her accolades, was quietly unraveling behind closed doors. This is the story of how a respected judge fell in love with a convicted felon. How a woman who once symbolized justice allowed herself to be seduced, betrayed, and ultimately broken. And how, in a moment of cold calculation, she took back control the only way she knew how, through blood. But this story isn't just about a murder. It's about loneliness, power, manipulation, and the terrible price of letting emotion overrule the law. It began in courtroom 3B on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Judge Claudia West had reviewed the appeal paperwork the night before. Nothing unusual. The petitioner, Tyrese Walton, was a 30-year-old serving 15 years for armed robbery. No priors before that. The crime was messy, but not extraordinary. A gas station holdup in Atlanta gone wrong. One clerk pistol whipped, another traumatized. The sentencing judge had called Tyrese intelligent but dangerous, a man capable of remorse but unwilling to change. Claudia didn't expect much from the hearing. These were routine, procedural, typically a formality. But the moment Tyrese Walton walked into the courtroom, something shifted. He wasn't what she expected. Tall, lean, composed. His orange jumpsuit hung loose, but his posture was regal, head high, hand behind his back. When his name was called, he stepped to the podium and locked eyes with her. Not with fear, not with aggression, but with something calm. Focused, almost knowing. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," he said, voice smooth like velvet rubbed across gravel. Claudia glanced down at her notes. "Mr. Walton, you are requesting a review of the circumstances surrounding your sentencing, citing lack of adequate counsel and mitigating trauma not considered at the time of trial. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "If I may speak freely?" She didn't usually allow it, but something in his tone made her nod. Tyrese spoke for nearly 7 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make excuses. He told a story of a childhood filled with instability, of a single mother who died when he was 16, of couch surfing through Atlanta and doing whatever he had to do to survive. He admitted to the robbery, said he never meant to hurt anyone, claimed he hadn't touched a gun since that day. "I was angry," he said, "angry at the world, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm tired. I want to build something, even if it's just inside these walls." Claudia didn't interrupt once. She sat stone still, pen hovering in her hand, listening. When it was over, she thanked him and said the court would review the case and issue a response within 30 days. Then she struck the gavel. Case adjourned. She should have walked out and forgotten him, but she didn't. That night, She replayed his speech in her mind, the rhythm of his words, the conviction in his voice, the pain behind his eyes. It lingered. Against her better judgment, she pulled his file back out. She scanned the notes, the psychiatric evaluations, the arrest report. She saw a man raised by chaos, shaped by violence, but with intelligence woven into every line. The next week, a letter arrived in her chambers. It was from Tyrese. Not a formal motion. A handwritten note, folded neatly, slipped through the bureaucratic maze with the help of a prison chaplain. It read, "Dear Judge West, I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to speak. It meant more than I can say. You looked at me like I was a person, not a case file. I've been thinking about that ever since. Sincerely, Tyrese Walton." Claudia read the letter twice. Then again, something about it struck her, not just the words, but the restraint in them. No flattery, no requests, just gratitude. She told herself there was no harm in responding. One note became two, then three. She justified it under the guise of rehabilitative encouragement. He started sending poetry. She responded with quotes from literature. They talked about Baldwin, Morrison, the law, regret, purpose. Then came the request. Could she visit? Claudia hesitated. Prison visits required clearance, paperwork, disclosure. But as a judge, she had latitude. And she used it. The first meeting was brief, official. Tyrese was respectful, soft-spoken. They talked through a security screen. She asked about his appeal. He asked about her favorite authors. She laughed when he quoted Maya Angelou. "You don't strike me as a poetry guy," she said. Tyrese smiled. Most people don't look hard enough. The guard's signal time was up. She left with her stomach in knots. From then on, the visits became regular. No longer about the appeal that had been denied. But she kept coming. She didn't tell anyone. She changed her routine, visiting on weekends, late afternoons, slipping out of chambers early, and making the hour-long drive in silence. At the prison, she would sit across from Tyrese in the visitation room, surrounded by dull concrete and fluorescent lights, feeling more alive than she had in years. There was no touching. Not yet. But there was a growing electricity, a kind of unspoken current that passed between them with every glance, every exchange. Her colleagues noticed the change. She was distracted, late, smiling at things no one else understood. Long days, one of her clerks asked once. Claudia simply replied, "You could say that." What she didn't say was, "I met someone, and I don't know how to stop." The line between right and wrong is rarely crossed in one stride. It's crossed in inches. For Judge Claudia West, those inches came quietly, almost innocently at first. A weekend visit here, a late-night letter there. But each step pulled her further from the black-and-white rules she once swore to uphold, into a gray, shifting place where reason bent to longing and caution fell to craving. After her third visit to Blackridge Correctional, Claudia stopped pretending this was about reform. It wasn't professional curiosity that made her wear lipstick before driving to the prison. It wasn't legal mentorship that made her heart race when Tyrese smiled at her from across the visitation table. And it certainly wasn't judicial duty that made her lie to her assistant, saying she had a doctor's appointment when she was really sitting in a concrete room across from a man serving 15 years. But she told herself stories. That's what intelligent people do when they need to justify the unjustifiable. He needs guidance. He's trying to change. He listens to me in a way no one else ever has. What began as letters and casual conversation morphed into something more intoxicating. Tyrese started speaking to her with familiarity, not the rehearsed respect of an inmate, but the gentle arrogance of a man who knew exactly the effect he had on her. "You ever think," he said one afternoon, "that maybe we were supposed to meet? That all the things that went wrong in our lives were just leading to this?" Claudia stiffened. "Don't romanticize this. You're an inmate. I'm a judge. This isn't a storybook." He leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. "Maybe it's not a storybook, but still real." She didn't reply, but she didn't stop him either. Soon, their visits became less about conversation and more about escape. Tyrese began drawing her, sketches of her hands, her smile, even one of her in her robe, only it wasn't a courtroom behind her in the drawing. It was a beach. Sunset. Wind in her hair. Claudia stared at that sketch for hours one night. She had never been drawn by a man before. The prison guards didn't question her frequent visits. Who would? She was a judge. Untouchable. Respected. She signed her own permissions, bypassed standard protocols, and used her position to secure private meeting slots. The visits were recorded, but lightly monitored. Tyrese knew how to work the space. He would sit just close enough to brush her fingers when passing a note. He'd lean in when speaking, voice low and intimate. Once, he let his hand linger on hers for a beat too long, and she didn't pull away. Afterward, she sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel, heart thundering. A single touch had left her shaken. She wanted more. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop. She typed out a resignation letter. She hovered over the print button, then closed the screen. She wasn't ready to let go of the robe or of him. At work, her focus slipped. She lost her temper at minor errors, misread filings, and started avoiding after-hours functions. One colleague, Judge Hannah Wells, tried to check in. "You all right, Claudia? You've been elsewhere lately." Claudia forced a smile. "Just tired." "You sure that's all it is?" There was a long pause. "Yeah," she lied. "That's all." But it wasn't. At home, she began locking her phone. She hid letters under her mattress. When her goddaughter came to visit one weekend, Claudia snapped at her for touching a drawer in her study. "Don't go in there," she barked. "That's private." The girl blinked in surprise. Claudia immediately apologized, blaming stress. But her goddaughter didn't come around again for months. The isolation didn't bother Claudia. Not then, because she had Tyrese. He was her escape, her secret, her rebellion against the cold, gray life she had spent decades constructing. In him, she saw warmth. In his eyes, she saw admiration. And in every carefully chosen word, she saw a man who made her feel wanted. It didn't occur to her, not yet, that she was being played. That each poem, each sketch, each whisper of destiny was a brick in a carefully constructed trap. That Tyrese Walton had seen straight through her the moment he stepped into that courtroom and recognized a woman desperate to feel alive. She thought she was in control. She didn't realize she'd already lost it. By the time spring arrived, the relationship between Judge Claudia West and Tyrese Walton was no longer just inappropriate. It was dangerous. The boundary line, once faint but present, had vanished altogether. What had started as guarded exchanges in a monitored room had transformed into a carefully choreographed intimacy, built on smuggled notes, whispered conversations, and a shared understanding that neither of them could breathe a word of it to anyone. Claudia used every ounce of her legal knowledge to keep their secret alive. She'd grown clever, too clever. She had learned which days the prison staff rotated shifts, which guards were less attentive, how to file paperwork that granted her extended legal consultations without raising alarms. She even used burner phones at one point, devices Tyrese somehow had access to through the prison's contraband network. They began calling each other by first name. She was no longer Your Honor. He wasn't Mr. Walton. It was Claudie and Ty, pet names in a prison visitation room. It was absurd. And yet, when Claudia looked at Tyrese, it didn't feel absurd. It felt like a second chance at something she had long believed out of reach: connection. He knew how to play her heart like a violin. "You know," he said one Saturday afternoon, "when I was a kid, I used to imagine being invisible, because I figured if no one could see me, they couldn't hurt me." Claudia's eyes softened. "That's heartbreaking." He smiled faintly. "Then you came along, and for the first time, I wanted to be seen." Lines like that, it should have set off alarm bells. But for Claudia, it landed like poetry. She wasn't just his judge. She was his savior. At least, that's how she wanted to believe it. Their relationship became more than just emotional. It became physical, carefully, sporadically, and always under the tightest secrecy. Claudia found ways to gain access to semi-private areas and used interview rooms, visitation stalls with limited surveillance angles. She'd plan every detail: where she'd park, how she'd enter, even what scent she wore. To the outside world, she was still the Honorable Judge West. Stern, composed, untouched by scandal. But behind the curtain, she was slipping further into a fantasy she had no control over. There were moments when guilt clawed at her. One Sunday evening, after an unusually tender visit, Claudia sat alone in her kitchen, staring down at her untouched dinner. What was she doing? She was a judge, a public servant, a woman who had spent her entire life demanding truth, honor, and discipline. And now she was sneaking into prison backrooms to kiss a man convicted of armed robbery. But even her shame couldn't drown the feeling Tyrese gave her. He saw her, not the robe, not the resume, not the reputation. Her. And that feeling? It was like oxygen after years of holding her breath. She began withdrawing from her circle, friends, colleagues, even family. Her best friend, Judge Hannah Wells, noticed the change and confronted her one afternoon over coffee. "You've been a ghost lately," Hannah said, eyeing her carefully. "Is there someone?" Claudia froze. "No," she lied too quickly. "There's no one." Hannah didn't believe her. "You look wrecked, but also kind of radiant. It's weird." Claudia forced a laugh and deflected, but the walls were closing in. At the courthouse, whispers had begun. An anonymous tip had reached the administrative board. Something about her visits to Blackridge being too frequent, too personal. The review was quiet, informal for now. But Tyrese wasn't worried. "They can't touch you," he told her during one of their late spring meetings. "You're a damn judge. They'll never believe it." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "And even if they do, would you really let me go?" She didn't answer, because deep down she already knew the answer. No, she wouldn't. She had staked everything on this. The quiet thrill, the connection, the lie she told herself that it was real, that it meant something. But there was one truth she hadn't yet faced. One detail that would shatter everything. Tyrese Walton was keeping a secret far more dangerous than theirs. And soon, that secret would surface. Not through gossip or rumor, but through blood. It started with a routine physical. Just another checkup, squeezed into Claudia West's increasingly chaotic calendar. She sat on the crinkling white paper in her doctor's office, glancing at the clock every 30 seconds, thinking about the pile of case files waiting on her desk. The nurse had drawn her blood quickly. Claudia barely noticed. She was preoccupied, already drafting an opinion in her head when Dr. Lillian Abramson stepped into the room with a folder and a look that made Claudia sit up straighter. "Claudia," the doctor began gently. "I need you to stay calm, okay?" Claudia blinked. "What's wrong?" "There's something in your labs. You tested positive for HIV." The room spun. "No," Claudia said, voice sharp and instant. "That can't be right. I don't. There must be some mistake." Dr. Abramson nodded slowly. "I ran it twice." "I'm sorry." Claudia's hands went numb. "Ow! I'm not." She caught herself. Swallowed hard. There was only one possibility. Tyrese. He was the only man she had been with in years. The only man, period, since her divorce nearly a decade earlier. She hadn't even kissed anyone else. There was no one else to blame. No other direction to look. Her heart pounded like a war drum. She didn't drive straight back to the courthouse. She didn't go home. Instead, she pointed her car toward Blackridge Correctional with white knuckles gripping the steering wheel and her brain spiraling into disbelief, rage, and betrayal. When she walked into the prison that afternoon, the guards greeted her with their usual nods of respect. No one saw the fire burning behind her eyes. Inside the visitation room, Tyrese was waiting. Same smirk, same posture, but Claudia's expression was stone. "Hey," he said, standing. "Everything okay? You look. When were you going to tell me?" She cut in, her voice low and sharp. Tyrese froze. "Tell you what." She leaned in, every word slicing the air. "That you're HIV positive." He blinked just once, then shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered." "Didn't matter?" Her voice cracked. "You let me, God, Tyrese. You let me trust you. You let me touch you. You looked me in the face and told me I mattered, and the whole time you were infected." He snapped, suddenly cold. "Like I'm some kind of disease." Claudia reeled back. "Don't you dare twist this." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think this place tests us regularly? You think I get a free ride to the clinic every month? Half the men in here got something. Nobody tells you anything. You're acting like I planned this. You knew, she said, her voice breaking. You knew and you let it happen. Tyrese sat back and looked away. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I stopped caring a long time ago. That was the moment something inside her snapped. The man who had written her poetry, who whispered about destiny, who said she made him feel seen, was gone. In his place was someone colder, harder, more familiar than she wanted to admit. She left the prison without saying another word. Her body was shaking as she walked past the guards. She didn't even notice the rain until she was already behind the wheel. At home that night, Claudia sat in the dark, staring at her own reflection in the window, her thoughts spinning like a storm. She pulled out every letter Tyrese had written her, every sketch, every quote. She read them over and over, looking for signs she had missed, red flags hidden beneath the romance. She found them all. The love bombing, the flattery, the way he mirrored her emotions so perfectly, the subtle manipulation wrapped in vulnerability. It had never been love. It had been control. She opened her laptop and pulled up the court transcripts from his original trial. Reread them line by line. Then she looked deeper, into his prison records, his disciplinary actions. She used her judicial access to uncover things most people couldn't. What she found chilled her. Tyrese had been disciplined multiple times for sexual conduct violations inside the prison. Some forced, some coercive, some transactional. She had been one of many. She wasn't special. She was a mark, and she had fallen for it completely. The shame clawed at her insides. She thought of the judges who had mentored her, the women who had looked up to her, the lives she'd sentenced, the oath she had taken. It all meant nothing now. She was infected, humiliated, and alone, but not powerless. That night, Claudia opened a drawer and pulled out an old, folding knife she kept for emergencies. She unfolded it, testing the blade with her thumb. Sharp, clean. She stared at it for a long time, until the sun began to rise. And when the light hit her face through the blinds, she whispered 4 words into the silence. He doesn't get away. Claudia West had always believed in due process. In the courtroom, she demanded structure, clarity, rules. But outside those walls, after what Tyrese Walton had done to her, Claudia wasn't looking for justice anymore. She wanted punishment, and this time, she would be the executioner. She spent 3 days in silence after their last encounter. No calls, no texts, no court appearances. She called in sick, something she hadn't done in 10 years. The courthouse staff barely questioned it. Judges needed space, too, they figured. In reality, Claudia was planning a murder. It started with a knife. It wasn't a gun she wanted. Guns were loud, messy, impersonal. A knife, on the other hand, small, intimate, silent. She knew exactly where to get one. A tactical shop just outside of Atlanta, the kind that catered to ex-cops and hunters. She paid in cash and kept the receipt. Then came the logistics. She studied the layout of the visitation room at Blackridge. She already knew the guards rotated every 2 hours and that the cameras ran on a fixed-angle system with no audio. She'd sat in that room enough times to know exactly where the blind spots were, exactly how long it took for the guards to respond when a prisoner raised their voice or leaned too far across the table. She timed all. 12 seconds. That's all she would need. 12 seconds to make him feel what she felt: shock, betrayal, fear. She packed her coat carefully the morning of. It was early May, unusually cool for Georgia, so no one would question the extra layers. She slipped the blade into the inner pocket, securing it with thread so it wouldn't shift. She wore gloves, the kind you could peel off in one move and drop into a trash bin. She washed her hands 3 times, not out of cleanliness, but ritual, focus. Before leaving the house, she sat at her desk and wrote 2 letters. One to her goddaughter, Amelia. You were the one thing in this world that made me believe there was still good in it. Please know this wasn't your fault. I made a mistake, and I'm fixing it. And one to Judge Hannah Wells. I broke every rule we were trained to protect. I betrayed everything we stood for. But I was also used, lied to, infected. I hope one day you understand why I couldn't just walk away. She placed both letters in envelopes, addressed them, and left them on the kitchen counter. She turned off her phone, locked the front door, got in her car and drove. It was a Thursday. Visitation at Blackridge started at 10 a.m. She walked into the prison with the calm, familiar stride of a judge conducting official business. The guards barely glanced at her credentials. They knew her, respected her. One of them even smiled. "Morning, Judge West." She smiled back. "Morning, Officer Daniels." As she entered the secure hallway leading to the visitation room, she passed the mirror station before the last security door. She caught a glimpse of herself, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't flinch. She looked composed, controlled, ready. Tyrese was already seated when she walked in. He looked surprised to see her, then pleased. His smile spread wide across his face. "Claudie," he said, leaning forward like he always did. "Didn't think I'd see you again." She said nothing, just sat down across from him and placed her hands flat on the table. "You all right?" he asked, tilting his head. "You look cold." Claudia stared at him. Her voice came out flat, void of emotion. "I came to deliver a verdict." He laughed. "What's that supposed to mean?" And that's what she moved. With a smooth, rehearsed motion, Claudia reached in her coat, pulled out the blade, and plunged it straight into his chest. Tyrese gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. He tried to stand, but she caught him in the side again. And again, the guards were yelling, running, but Claudia didn't hear them. All she heard was the rush of blood in her ears, the sound of her own breath, and the wet, gurgling cries of the man who had broken her. By the time the guards tackled her to the ground, the blade had fallen from her hand. She didn't fight, didn't scream. She just looked at Tyrese, now slumped over the table, his blood pooling beneath him, staining the steel gray floor. Then she sat down calmly, smoothed her coat, and waited. When the guards demanded she put her hands up, she did. When they read her rights, she nodded. And when they asked if she had anything to say, she simply whispered, "He knew what he did. And so did I." It was over. But for Claudia West, this was just the beginning. Thursday, May 9th, 10:42 a.m. Blackridge Correctional Facility, Visitation Room B. Everything about that morning had felt routine. The sky was overcast, the air crisp. Judge Claudia West had walked through the security gates with her ID badge clipped to her coat, her usual stoic expression in place. The guards waved her through with casual respect. No one noticed the slight bulge sewn into the inner pocket of her coat. No one asked questions. She had been here too many times before. Tyrese Walton was already seated at the visitation table when she entered. He looked up with that familiar crooked smile, the one that used to make her stomach flutter. This time, it made her nauseous. "Claudie," he said, voice smooth. "Didn't expect you today. Thought maybe you'd ghosted me." Claudia sat down slowly across from him, folding her hands together like she used to in court. Her eyes didn't blink. Her face didn't move. Tyrese chuckled awkwardly. "You good?" Silence. Then finally she spoke. Quiet. Controlled. "I know." Tyrese's smile faltered. "Know what?" "I know what you gave me." There was his moment of realization. A flicker in his eyes. Not fear. Not guilt. Just recognition. Like a man who had been caught red-handed, but had already made peace with it. "Claudia," he said softly, leaning in, lowering his voice. "You don't understand how things work in here." That was the last sentence he ever finished. In one swift movement, Claudia reached into her coat, drew the knife, and drove it straight into his chest. Tyrese gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. He tried to push back, tried to scream, but she was already in motion, stabbing again. And again. The blade struck with surgical precision, neck, side, gut. The guards on the other side of the glass jumped to their feet. "Code red," someone shouted. "Visitation room. Now." But by the time they reached her, it was done. Tyrese collapsed forward, his blood cascading across the cold metal table like a dark river. His mouth opened, closed. A single word escaped. "What?" Claudia stood still. Her eyes never left his face. "You knew what you were doing," she said, barely above a whisper. "And so did I." Then she let the knife drop. It clattered onto the table, echoing like a gavel strike. Final. Absolute. The guard stormed in, guns drawn, shouting orders. Hands up! Don't move! Claudia raised her hands calmly. No resistance. No expression. As if she had just adjourned a hearing. As if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The blood on her coat was still warm. She was cuffed, read her rights, and led out of the visitation room. Inmates in nearby cells craned their necks to see what had happened. Whispers followed her down the corridor like smoke. Was that the judge? She stabbed him. Holy sh**. Back in the visitation room, Tyrese Walton was pronounced dead at 10:49 a.m. Surveillance footage would later show the entire incident, from the moment Claudia entered to the exact second she drove the knife into his chest to the eerie calm that settled over her once it was done. The footage became the crown jewel of the prosecution's case. But in that room, in those 7 blood-soaked minutes, Claudia West wasn't a judge, or a woman scorned, or a public figure with a shattered life. She was something else entirely. She was wrath given shape, and she didn't flinch. The news hit like a grenade. Georgia judge stabs inmate to death during visitation. Respected jurist turns killer in shocking prison slaying. Justice or revenge? The fall of Judge Claudia West. Within hours, the story dominated every network in the country. Cable news anchors clutched their microphones with breathless urgency. Legal experts scrambled to provide commentary. Talk shows speculated about motive, mental illness, and secret romance. Social media exploded with theories. But behind all the noise, the truth was simpler and far darker. Judge Claudia West had murdered Tyrese Walton in cold blood, and the whole thing was caught on tape. At the Fulton County Jail, she was processed like any other suspect. Mugshot taken, personal items logged. The irony wasn't lost on the officers. Many of them had once stood in her courtroom as she handed down sentences. Now, she stood in chains. "You sure you want a public defender?" one intake officer asked, almost incredulous. Claudia replied flatly, yes. She refused visitors, refused to make a statement, refused to grant interviews. Her silence only fueled the firestorm. 2 days later, the DA announced formal charges, second-degree murder. No bail, no leniency. The surveillance footage became the linchpin of the case. It was damning. From a moment she walked into the visitation room to the final blood-soaked seconds when she dropped the knife and sat calmly at the table, it left no room for doubt. At her arraignment, the courtroom was packed with reporters and legal colleagues. Some came out of disbelief, others out of morbid curiosity. Claudia entered in a beige jumpsuit, wrists shackled at her sides. Her once sharp eyes were dull, but her posture was straight. She didn't flinch when the judge read the charges. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Her lawyer, a quiet man named Stuart Langley, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental defect. The courtroom buzzed. Claudia didn't look at anyone. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded vigilante who used her authority to bypass prison protocols and orchestrate a premeditated killing. They showed the video, frame by frame. The knife, the stare, the unflinching calm. She didn't lose control, the lead prosecutor said during closing arguments. She planned this. She practiced this. She executed it like a verdict. The defense leaned heavily into emotional trauma. They brought in psychologists who testified about Claudia's deteriorating mental state, how years of loneliness, a toxic romantic entanglement, and a devastating betrayal of being infected with HIV drove her to the edge. She was manipulated, Stuart Langley argued. She was groomed, and when she realized she had been used, physically, emotionally, psychologically, she snapped. They showed evidence of Tyrese's prison record, disciplinary write-ups for sexual misconduct, contraband phone use, reports of manipulation of female staff. The courtroom was divided. Some saw a fallen judge who had finally broken. Others saw a woman who thought she was above the law, until she became a cautionary tale. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Sentence: 30 years in state prison. No parole. Claudia didn't cry when the sentence was read. She didn't speak. But those who sat behind her swore They saw her mouth one word under her breath. Good. After sentencing, she was transferred to a women's correctional facility in northern Georgia. No special treatment. No privacy. Just another number in the system she once ruled over. Her robes were gone. Her courtroom was gone. Her power was gone. And yet, in some twisted way, she seemed freer than ever. A former colleague, Judge Hannah Wells, visited once. Just once. When she asked Claudia why she did it, why she didn't just walk away, Claudia finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, but certain. He infected me, she said, with more than a virus. He infected me with shame, with silence. And nobody punishes men like that. Not really. So I did. And then she turned away. Conversation over. The prison guards say Claudia keeps to herself now. She reads constantly, writes in a small leather notebook, refuses interviews even after all these years. One guard described her as peaceful, but haunted, and maybe that's the price she chose. Not freedom, not forgiveness, just silence and the satisfaction of knowing justice, in her eyes, had finally been served. Years later, the name Claudia West still echoes through Georgia's legal circles, not as a symbol of justice, but as a cautionary tale. Law schools teach her case alongside landmark decisions and judicial ethics. Professors pause at her story, pointing to it as a devastating reminder that no one, not even a judge, is immune to emotional vulnerability, to manipulation, to human failure. Her courtroom, once a place of order and dignity, now stands in quiet contrast to the scandal that followed. New judges occupy the bench she once commanded. Her framed portrait was quietly removed from the hallway outside courtroom 3B. No ceremony, no mention, just gone. But the questions she left behind still linger. How does someone so deeply rooted in the law become its violator? How does a woman who upheld justice for 20 years cross the line with a man she once sentenced? And why, when she realized the betrayal, did she choose blood over the law? Those closest to her still wrestle with the answers. Her goddaughter, Amelia, never spoke to the media. But in a letter shared years later, she wrote, "She was like stone when I was growing up. Quiet, stern, but she was also the first person who told me I mattered. I think she just wanted to feel that for herself, even once. I wish she'd chosen a different way." Colleagues were less forgiving. Judge Marcus Lee, who shared a bench with Claudia during their early careers, said in a 60 Minutes interview, "She didn't fall. She jumped, eyes wide open. I don't pity her. I pity the law she shattered on her way down." Inmate advocates, however, raised different concerns. How did Tyrese Walton, a man with a documented history of sexual manipulation and medical red flags, gain such proximity to a sitting judge? Why wasn't he monitored more closely? Was Claudia West his only victim, or just the most visible one? The Department of Corrections launched an internal audit. New rules were drafted. Visitation protocols were tightened. Judges could no longer enter facilities alone without third-party supervision. But the changes came too late for Claudia and for Tyrese. In the years since her conviction, Claudia West has refused all interview requests. She remains incarcerated at North Haven Women's Facility, where she reportedly spends her days reading case law and journaling in silence. Some inmates call her the judge. Others avoid her altogether. Her legal license was revoked. Her legacy on the bench erased. But the story lingers. Documentaries have been made. Podcasts dissect every letter, every court file, every minute of that surveillance footage. One true crime series dubbed her Lady Justice with blood on her hands. And yet, the public remains torn. Some see her as a woman pushed past the brink, a victim who snapped after a cruel betrayal. Others see her as a narcissist who used her position to pursue forbidden desire, then tried to reclaim power through violence. Whatever side you fall on, one truth remains. Judge Claudia West was once the embodiment of law and order. And then she broke every rule she was sworn to uphold. And in doing so, she became part of the very system she used to judge, with a number, not a name, and a sentence that echoes far louder than any verdict she ever delivered. This wasn't just a story about a judge who killed a man. It was a story about loneliness, about power, about what happens when the person trusted to uphold justice lets desire, shame, and desperation consume them. Judge Claudia West spent over 2 decades on the bench, commanding courtrooms with precision and pride. She handed down sentences, gave lectures on legal ethics, mentored younger judges. In the eyes of the public, she was incorruptible. But underneath that black robe was a woman starving for connection. Tyrese Walton saw that, and he used it. He offered her poetry instead of prison bars, tenderness instead of steel. He gave her a fantasy, one where she was more than just a judge, more than just a title, one where she was loved. But when that fantasy shattered, when she discovered the infection, the betrayal, the truth, Claudia didn't seek the court. She didn't press charges. She didn't file a grievance. She picked up a knife, and in that prison visitation room, she traded law for vengeance. Some call it crime of passion. Others call it premeditated justice. But whatever you name it, the reality remains. A woman sworn to uphold the law became its breaker, and the system, for once, held her accountable. There's a chilling irony in it all, that the cameras, the very same tools she once trusted in court to deliver truth, recorded every second of her dissent. The stare, the blade, the moment she chose blood over justice. Those images will never fade. And maybe that's the most haunting part of her legacy, because it forces us to ask, what happens when the line between judge and criminal isn't as thick as we think? What happens when the scales of justice tip, not because of corruption or greed, but because of heartbreak? In the end, Claudia West wasn't destroyed by power. She was undone by something far more human, longing. And when longing met betrayal, the result was irreversible. A gavel didn't end her career. A knife did.